thanks a lot, everyone, for coming over to this room that has been arranged by the University of Chicago, where Ken Pomeranz is teaching. And it's my great honor to introduce him as this year's, or especially last year's Toynbee Prize winner. And he's, of course, going to be at the center of this event. But at the very beginning, let me just briefly introduce myself. My name is Dominik Sachsenmeier, professor at Göttingen University in Germany. And since 2015 or 14, I'm serving as the president of the Toynbee Prize Foundation, together with Darren McMahon of Dartmouth College, our vice president, and Nicole Boydis of Cambridge University, our executive director, and a whole range of trustees. And maybe just a few words about our foundation. I mean, the Toynbee Prize has a history that is dating back to the 1960s, and the history is somewhat murky. If anybody has an interest in an MA student, a master's student who would like to write his or her thesis on that topic, that might well be worth it. I mean, originally the prize was awarded to contributions to the development of the social sciences as defined from a broad historical view of human society and human and social problems. And among the early winners were people like Arthur Schlesinger, Ralph Dahrendorf, and Jean-Paul Sartre, who actually accepted the prize in contrast to the Nobel Prize. Yeah. Then in the 1990s, the Toynbee Prize Foundation decided to focus specifically on global historical scholarship. And mind you, as we all know, during the 1990s, the term global history was still rare and hardly used. So that at that time, it was meant to encourage scholars in a field that was still more like a postulate or a vision. And since then, of course, global history has become like a rather well-developed field in a variety of countries and academic systems, and that in some ways affects all branches of historical scholarship, ranging from cultural history to economic history. So now the prize is, in some ways, as we see it, is a prize, a biennial award that recognizes important and unique contributions to this field, which is now in some ways like already a whole international landscape of scholarship. And our recent winners and recipients include Deepesh Chakrabarty, Christopher Bailey, Jürgen Osterhammel, and Lauren Benton. And I mean, this list of scholars probably suffices to clarify one point, that in spite of its name, the Toynbee Prize Foundation doesn't award prizes to scholars whose thinking is situated in the vicinity of Arnold Joseph Toynbee. I mean, Toynbee's worldviews have been criticized and problematized, and I think for good reasons. But I mean, it is for historical reasons that the Toynbee Prize is called a Toynbee Prize. And our foundation's board of trustees has now evolved into a global network of distinguished practitioners of the field that are not only based in the United States or the UK and countries like Germany, but also in Turkey, India, South Korea, Japan, and other countries. And we operate a website and a blog where we have a lot of information about the latest developments in the field of global history in a variety of countries all over the world. And if you want to check that out, it's the web address is toynbeeprize.org. And now to turn to our prize winner, Kenneth Pomeranz, and who, as many, if not all of us know, is a university professor of East Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Chicago. And he, as I just mentioned at the very beginning, he has been named the winner of the Toynbee Prize already in 2021, but due to the pandemic, we decided to move this award to 2022, to the ceremony at least, hoping that we would be able to meet in person. That again didn't happen due to Omicron this year, but now we decided to hold this award ceremony online. We're taping it as we would have taped the event in physical presence, and we'll make it available on our website and elsewhere. And as a scholar who is interested in both global and Chinese history, my own academic journey has been deeply impacted by Ken's work, and I'm thus personally very, very happy that he has won the prize. And but I should mention that as president of the foundation, I didn't have any say in or over the actual selection process. Ken, he grew up in New York City, and he graduated, he received his doctoral degree in history from Yale University in 1988, and where one of his main advisors was actually Jonathan Spence, who passed away recently, as many of us know. And he taught at the University of California at Irvine for many years before moving to the University of Chicago in around 2012. And Ken has a long list of academic recognitions and achievements. And since we are meeting under the umbrella of the American Historical Association, even though we're no longer meeting in an online room provided by that association, I should stress that he served as the AHA president in 2013 and 14. And I should also not fail to mention that the Toynbee Prize isn't exactly the first prize that Ken Pomeranz has ever won. I mean, for instance, he shared the World History Association Book Prize in 2001, and he has won twice, I mean, repeat twice, the prestigious John King Fairbank Prize that is awarded to authors of a book in East Asian and Central Asian history. And I think, I mean, these combination of these two prizes now, of course, adding the Toynbee Prize into the picture, but of world and global history prizes and East Asian history prizes, I mean, he tells us a lot about his work and his academic contributions. They are highly influential among experts in Chinese history, but they're also important for Europeanists and other scholarly communities. And of course, they have been very, very important for contributions to global historical scholarship. I mean, just to name some of his books and edited volumes, one of them, The Making of a Hinterland, State, Society, and Economy in Inland North China, 1853 to 1937. And of course, like his monograph, The Great Divergence, China, Europe, and the Making of the Modern World Economy, that was published in 2000, and had a huge impact, of course, in not only in the field of global historical scholarship, global history, but in many other branches of academic life. And it has been, like many of his other works, this book has been translated into many languages and intensely debated by scholars in different parts of the world. And its influence goes far beyond the community of global economic historians. And we can see it as an early classic in the field of global history. And we're all looking forward to Ken's future next publications. He's currently working on a monograph called Why is China So Big?, which is the basis for his talk. He's also writing a co-authored, together with Daniel Siegel, world history textbook with a lot of emphasis on introducing students to how to do history and what the social and political stakes are in disputes over different narratives. And he's one of the 4 authors of another book called Economic Development in the Anthropocene. So we very much look forward. I'm looking forward to these works, Ken. For reasons of time, because we lost some time at the very beginning, I'm not gonna read out some of the statements of our trustees, but if you want to check our website, you will find statements, comments on Ken Pomeranz's works and his achievements and his contributions by scholars like David Armitage, Xiongbing Zhen from Hong Kong, Erica Chardish from Oxford, and some other scholars. But for that, please check out our website. So this would have been the moment that I, together with Darren, would hand over now the prize and the diploma to you, Ken. So I'll do that online.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
My virtual handshake. And we are very much looking forward to your lecture now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you to those of you who either braved the elements to make it to this room in Chicago today or braved what other elements were necessary to get to the place where your laptop sits so that you could watch on Zoom.
The camera has a switch.
Can you do that, I suppose? Okay. So we can do world history by looking for things that are clearly super-regional: pandemics, climate, technology, religion, and working from their global circulation down into processes of uptake and influence in particular places. Or we can work by building up from national and regional cases, pointing to comparisons and connections: nationalism, industrialization, democratization and its recent retreat, etc. This latter approach is much closer to Arnold Toynbee's own work, thoughtfully explored in Jürgen Osterhammel's 2017 prize lecture, based as it was on civilizations as a unit. But this is not usually an either-or choice, but a matter of methodological emphasis. Except perhaps for pre-modern climate shifts, all historical phenomena have origins that owe more to the actions of people in some specific places than others, and all are thus colored by the particular cultures of those actors. A very few of those big stories have origins in some particular place, but may have been driven by factors that seem so general to humans that we can tell them as the stories of a universalized, culture-free humanity. The early spread of Homo sapiens from Africa to the rest of the world is probably the clearest example. But even here, we should remember that we may in fact be compelled to rely on universal motives, such as hypothetical overcrowding, mostly because we are relying on archaeological data that is necessarily silent about individuals' thoughts. Where our data don't force us to rely on so-called needs that are allegedly independent of cultural particularities, culture-free cases where we are really fully satisfied with such explanations are few. Other world history phenomena seem better accounted for by some combination of a globe-down approach that begins with some nearly universal dynamic and the aggregation of bottom-up, culturally specific stories. Consider, for instance, the spread of electrification. This was a technology so obviously advantageous that it tempts us to say that it simply answered a need for more plentiful, adaptable, cheaper, and cleaner energy than fossil fuel burning engines alone could generate. Moreover, it occurred in a world already densely connected enough to facilitate close imitation of a single model. Yet even that story has had enough highly significant national and regional variations across the globe in the speed of uptake, in the political economy of production, in the uses and users prioritized by different states, and so on, that it is difficult to render as a single story. Some earlier instances of the global spread of very powerful technologies can be told as stories of irresistible spread and of great similarities with minor differences. But again, this is mostly true if one looks from a great distance and at a very long time scale. On scales closer to those of ordinary human experience, this works less well. Consider, for instance, the spread of printing, which for centuries skipped over some large literate polities, especially in South Asia and the Middle East, and which for a long time took very different technological forms in East Asia with its non-alphabetic languages, and Euro-America, the two world regions where it spread most rapidly, though with a big time lag between its Eastern and Western variants. And if one adds the different ways that powerful institutional players responded to printing, for instance, with very different regimes of regulation and censorship, often based on licensing and pre-publication censorship in Europe versus post-publication punishment with less formal legal structures in East Asia, then it becomes no accident that the world history of printing still seems to require assembling distinct stories to connect and compare. There is no global counterpart to Eisenstein's history of early printing in Europe. Even pre-modern climate change, which I mentioned before as one of the likeliest examples of a story that asks to be told on a global level, remains a series of more specific and varied stories once we turn to its impact. Geoffrey Parker's magisterial history of the 17th century climate crisis, though very much committed to telling a planetary story, is written as a series of chapters that each covers social, political, and cultural responses in one specific place. And the general lessons with which Parker concludes hinge on identifying two places where he judges the national political leadership to have shown particular insight and made unusual institutional innovations. Indeed, as 2014 Toynbee Prize winner Dipesh Chakrabarty has noted, trying to tell even the story of the Anthropocene with a single humanity as the actor, though useful for some purposes, strains the fundamental conventions of history and obliterates significant political and ethical issues. Yet we still want world histories that are more than the sum of national or regional stories, and we should. Insofar as we hope to generate histories for citizens of the world, as opposed to the histories for national citizens that have dominated the last 2 centuries, it's natural to want lessons on a world scale. So that tends to be where world history monographs begin and end, even if, as in Parker's case, those lessons are derived from comparing distinct national or imperial responses to a global phenomenon that take up all the chapters in between. But as that example, among many others, suggests, the desire for lessons, or if you prefer meaning, on a global level doesn't preclude writing and then combining particular stories. That does not mean, however, that simply aggregating enough particular stories gives us world history. It's important that we craft these geographically limited stories with an eye on global themes throughout the process, so that the global picture we wind up with is not made of discrete blocks snapped together by attaching conclusions that appear only when we synthesize conclusions for each separate case, but one in which the cases themselves are linked by threads that run through each globally infused regional story at every level, including the formulation of our initial questions. And it's in that spirit that I feel justified in using a world history lecture to discuss a project of my own that clearly works primarily on imperial, national, and regional scales, but which is punctuated by repeated efforts to put that story into world history frameworks. A roughly 2/3 finished book called Why is China So Big? Although I think my editor is calling Why is this book so late? Which I will reframe slightly for today's purposes as Chinese expansion as world history. So the lecture is, as I just said, mostly drawn from a small part of Why is China So Big? But it's crucial to frame the larger project and frame it globally. Often that involves framing Chinese events as strikingly different from patterns observed elsewhere. But we'll also see large and small ways in which looking at China highlights global trends, including some that have more often been framed as particularly European in origin. So it's striking that for most of the last 2,000 years, and almost all of the last 700, about 1/4 of humanity, now down to about 1/5, has been part of one polity. Moreover, of the 6 states that cover roughly 40% of the Earth today, Russia, Canada, China, the US, Brazil, and Australia, 5 benefited from what Alfred Crosby called ecological imperialism, in which 16th to 19th century settlers brought diseases to which natives had no resistance, and also brought plants and animals that had no enemies in their new homes, greatly facilitating conquest and colonization. Chinese expansion largely lacked these supports, and so is even more striking. Today's People's Republic can also be seen in global perspective. Why are we not? Moving down. Today's PRC can also be seen as successor to one of several large multi-ethnic empires that flourished circa 1400 to 1918. The others, Mughal, Ottoman, Romanov, Habsburg, etc., fractured into multiple states, as did, of course, Europe's later overseas empires, and as China did for a while. But China today includes almost all of the Qing realm, despite a century of incursions by stronger powers. The ongoing creation and recreation of this unity matters for both scholarly and other issues. My focus today is on one part of this story, how Chinese elites came to think of areas that were conquered by the Qing between roughly 1683 and 1759. You see them here, and another perspective on them here, including areas that had rarely or never previously been ruled by China as domestic in today's sense of domestic policy. That is, as part of the realm's bounded internal territory, whether that realm was the Qing, the Republic, or the People's Republic. But it also invokes domestic in the sense of related to household matters. In this case, coming to think of various frontiers as places where so-called good subjects, later citizens, could create proper families and thus communities. Looking forward from China's deep past, as I will in a minute, this is a story of rethinking long-running, culturally specific debates about the proper relationship of cultural and political boundaries, and the degree to which geography placed an indelible stamp on human character. Viewed retrospectively, from the mid-20th century, it becomes a story of how Chinese elites participated in preparing the ground for the adoption of modern ideas of territoriality, sovereignty, and the national rather than imperial notion that a sovereign state's internal space should be essentially homogeneous. It's also very much a story of global phenomena in which China was arguably a bit ahead of the curve. Firstly, we see the growth of long-distance migration of and organized by free commoners, eventually eclipsing the scale of state-directed migrations and elite-controlled movements of dependent, including enslaved peoples. And secondly, we see how states that were initially quite ambivalent about such uncontrolled migrant streams came to accept and promote them, eventually backing plebeian frontiers people whom they had initially disparaged, but had gradually come to view as their own, often jettisoning in the process accommodations that they had previously had with indigenous elites to maintain stability in the borderlands. Let us begin with China's distinctive path to modern territoriality. In a classic 1968 essay on the Chinese world order, John Fairbank contrasted modern states, geographically limited, but absolutely sovereign within their borders, with a Chinese idea of universal empire, which he believed had endured from ancient times until 19th century Western impact. An empire centered on a son of heaven who, if properly virtuous, would be acknowledged by all under heaven. That empire did not necessarily rule everyone directly. Outer regions would often have their own rulers and offer only occasional tribute to the center. Moreover, actual rulers and circumstances were bound to be imperfect, leaving plenty of room for realpolitik. But in theory, the realm was an unbounded, set of increasingly unenlightened concentric circles. That's what you see here. In 2007, Alex Woodside revisited this interpretation in light of a, by then, booming field of borderland studies. Woodside noted that the all under heaven framework defined the center precisely as the place from which civilization and its blessings radiated outwards, but largely ignored borders. Outlying territories contributed nothing, except that their obedience confirmed the center's greatness. Moreover, the important object of rule was people, who of course could move, not territory. And success in ruling faraway people meant that they, quote, turned towards civilization in various symbolic ways, not that they necessarily paid taxes, submitted to censuses, or settled their disputes by the central government's laws. Furthermore, Chinese political thought often emphasized that involvement with frontiers could easily have negative results. Imperfect rulers might use force to subdue these disorderly regions, causing expensive hostilities that eventually undermined the whole polity. Moreover, though Chinese rulers did often covet frontier resources, such as mines or herds of horses, they rarely imagined integrating them into an expanded, wealth-enhancing division of labor. When frontier resources were seized, it was often in order to avoid paying potential enemies for them. The goal was stopping a drain, not generating growth. In short, the frontier was seen less as a zone of opportunity than as a source of problems to be managed. The most optimistic visions might imagine civilizing frontier folk, but strictly for their own good. The already civilized center had nothing to gain. Now, these are oversimplifications, as even the people who formulated them knew. Chinese states often drew sharply defined borders when it suited them, and at least de facto, sometimes treated other states as peers. Moreover, the idea of one universal empire, embodying the one true civilization, was not only routinely compromised in practice, it had also been balanced from very early times by the counter idea that some people and places were uncivilizable. In particular, Chinese elites generally argued that where you couldn't farm, people would be migratory. They wouldn't have property, they wouldn't tend ancestral graves, and so on. And such people would always be barbarous and untrustworthy. That view, though contested, appeared even in some pre-imperial texts and solidified in Sima Qian's Shiji, or historical records, completed somewhere around 91 BCE. In other words, soon after major Han triumphs over nomads. That text became a model for subsequent Chinese history writing, all the way down to the 20th century, and provided a mold within which the idea that topography could preclude civilization became increasingly dominant, repeatedly portraying what were often blurry, fluid, step-zone relations as if they were fixed and eternally hostile. Ban Gu, a slightly later historian, 32 to 92 CE, provided this often quoted formulation. Barbarians have a human face and beast's heart. They follow their herds across the grassland and hunt for a living. They are separated from us by mountains and gorges and barred by the desert. Therefore, the sage kings treated them as beasts and birds, did not make treaties with them, and were not engaged in offensive expeditions. If you make a treaty with them, they spend the gifts and then deceive you. If you attack them, then the army is exhausted and you induce banditry. Many later scholars also insisted that the environment limited northern border tribes in particular to occupations inconsistent with civilization. Pictures of Southerners were more varied and equivocal. Those areas were well-watered and thus potentially arable, so many literati and officials had somewhat greater hopes for civilizing them. And over the centuries, much Southern territory was indeed absorbed. while many communities that had successfully resisted Chinese rule simultaneously adopted what the Chinese saw as, quote, civilized ways, such as sedentarism and intensive rice cultivation. By contrast, Chinese holdings in the north, especially the northwest, shrank more often than they grew over the very long haul between 81 BCE and 1661 CE. Unsurprisingly then, through much of imperial history, maps often showed sharp borders in the north, but rarely in the south. This is a Song Dynasty map by perhaps the period's most prominent cartographer. You will note a wall in the north. That wall actually wasn't there. It was at the time purely a conceptual wall, though it did come to be built. This second map comes from a Buddhist source, but you note once again, this imagined wall in the north marking a very clean difference between the places where there's stuff going on, and you have things to write, and the places that are essentially blank. Whereas in the south, things fade out much more gradually until you eventually hit the ocean. But given the altitude, aridity, and so on of many areas around China, and here are 3 different ways of seeing that, gives you an idea of just how much of China is not particularly farming friendly. It's a precipitation map. Anywhere below this line, agriculture is pretty dicey, or beyond this line, I should say. And anywhere beyond this line, it's extraordinarily difficult. And then this is my favorite, actually. This is a 1940s, actually National Geographic, I think, map, but it gives you a sense of just how much of China is not the flat arable plain that it appears as in our imagination. And given those obstacles to arability, the idea that civilization required an agricultural base sharply limited how much adjacent territory one should think of incorporating. And those limits had arguably been reached with the absorption of Manchuria on the one hand and Taiwan on the other in the 17th century. 18th century expansion, focused on Central Asia, was different, essentially a matter of forward defense against people understood as forever alien in lands unfit for immigrants. So it wasn't simply moralism that made the state leave some frontiers undefined and many frontier resources untapped. There were also geophysical reasons for thinking that one should just hope that far-flung borders wouldn't wind up being unaffordable. Modern scholars for a long time generally thought that this view didn't begin to change until almost 1900, when foreign imperialist pressures led to a sudden surge of nationalism and inspired defensive colonization efforts on the frontier. Recent research shows that that nationalist turn was reinforced by emerging concerns about securing frontier mineral resources for newly critical military and industrial projects. By the 1920s, some people imagined Mongolia accommodating 80 million Chinese. Sun Yat-sen, somewhat more realistically, proposed 10 million settlers. Nor were such fantasies a particularly Chinese disorder. An English military strategist estimated in 1932 that southern Xinjiang alone could comfortably accommodate 160 million new residents, if properly irrigated. Has about 11 million people today. Such dreams also fit into another modern global trend, enthusiasm for massive irrigation projects that aim to make arid, sunny regions into agricultural heartlands. Trend that arguably began with Arthur Cotton's schemes for Southwest India in the 1840s and moved on to projects in Australia, Punjab, the US and Canadian West, Kazakhstan, and elsewhere. Significantly, the first Chinese plans to massively expand irrigation in Xinjiang predated these Western examples by several decades. They also had a separate, though ultimately less transformative, technological basis. While Cotton and his Western successors used new industrial tools like cement and steam-powered pumps to divert rivers, early 19th century Chinese schemes relied on long-known gravity-driven techniques from Persia and Central Asia to bring mountain snowmelt and springs to lowland fields, and on traditional Chinese-style gates and polders to control the water once it got to the lowlands. Now, as this suggests, attributing the radical reimagining of Chinese frontiers to a sudden anti-imperialist awakening and awareness of new Western technologies starting around 1900 misses a crucial prelude and thereby exaggerates the role of external stimuli. Gradual homegrown changes in conceptualizing frontiers began much earlier and made later developments possible, so that we cannot simply tell a story of a global wave that starts in the Atlantic world and eventually reaches China. We need to look instead for what might explain similar, though distinct developments with separate origins, ending in substantial but still incomplete convergence, as represented by, among other things, China's distinctive system of so-called autonomous regions in many border areas today. But before tracing those changes, I should sketch more of the baseline from which they occurred, tracing ideas about civilian migration, which complemented the above ideas about government handling of borderlands. The modern world intrudes. One time-honored truism about traditional Chinese notions of ethnicity or nationality is that they were culturalist rather than biological or racial, i.e., somebody who followed Chinese ways could be considered Chinese, regardless of skin color or eye folds. This culturalism echoes through the classics, with stories of ancient sage kings from barbarian lands and so forth. And it fit well with thinking that frontier peoples could be potentially transformed and made indistinguishable from those of the Central Plain. Now, this could, one would think, also have meant that there was no shame in admitting having ancestors who had been, quote, uncivilized. In fact, it might make them even more honorable to have embraced civilization by choice. And a great many leading families did have mixed or non-Han origins. Indeed, many Han in South China today can be shown by many kinds of evidence, including DNA, who clearly descend from assimilated indigenous populations. I don't have time to go into any detail about this map, but it traces distribution of particular genes in various Chinese populations. Unfortunately, they didn't get data for most of the far West. But what you see briefly is that most of the people north of the Yellow River who are today labeled Han share a closer genetic tie, using this marker, to the people north of the Yangtze River who are labeled non-Han, who are said to belong to other groups, than they do with people south of the Yangtze who are labeled Han. And those people south of the Yangtze, in turn, share more with the ethnic minorities there than they do with their alleged fellow Han to the north. But almost no genealogy ever admits this, at least about male ancestors. Without exception, socially successful families in Central and South China have claimed descent from men, usually high-ranking ones, who fled the north or the Yangtze Valley during a barbarian conquest or government collapse. Both the alleged points of origin and the alleged reasons for flight are significant here. The ancestors are not said to have gone to the frontier to find opportunities beyond what the heartland normally offered, but instead to have moved in order to preserve and reproduce civilization when it had been temporarily interrupted in the heartland. Of course, this ideology hadn't stopped millions from going to the frontiers precisely for personal opportunity, especially during the Qing. Indeed, late Ming and Qing China, as I said before, were arguably on the cutting edge of a major global trend: the rise of large-scale, long-distance migration organized by free commoner migrants themselves, gradually eclipsing the scale of state-directed colonization, elites relocating along with large numbers of their dependents, and long-distance, large-scale slave trading. This had probably happened by about 1600 in China, or certainly by 1700. In the Atlantic world, long-distance free migration probably began around the same time as in China, but there were fewer people involved, and they did not outnumber unfree migrants until well into the 19th century. The increasing numbers of free plebeian migrants in late imperial China did not particularly please the state or its allied elites. On the contrary, they often saw such migrations as destabilizing. The Qing, as we will see, often tried to restrict such migration, though with limited success. Moreover, the patterns I noted a minute ago, in which descendants of successful migrants told stories that erased precisely those elements that made their ancestors distinctively early modern, remind us how much intellectual distance had to be crossed before the 20th century's embrace of massive frontier settlement schemes became imaginable. Part of the story behind that cultural change was deeply ironic. The Manchu-led Qing dynasty made the Northwest frontier seem tamer by winning China, and here, of course, China must be in quotes, biggest victories there in a millennium, combining Chinese and Central Asian military and political techniques to destroy once threatening Mongols. The Qing were also enabled by a crucial coincidence: Russia's simultaneous expansion eastward. These sometimes rivals became de facto partners, negotiating Westphalian-style fixed borders in equal treaties that obligated both sides to prevent cross-border flight and violence. Thus, steppe peoples could no longer retreat indefinitely from the Qing's Chinese forces and then counterattack at a better moment. And with the end of the possibility of indefinite flight, such groups could finally be decisively defeated. Now, Chinese elites did not necessarily initially see the lands thus gained as part of their empire. When fighting ended in 1759, many Han officials and intellectuals recommended withdrawing from what is now Xinjiang, calling it wasteland that would never repay the cost of ruling it. But after 1820's unrest in Xinjiang had been suppressed, at a cost so high that it might well have confirmed that original assessment that you shouldn't be there, statecraft-oriented Han Chinese intellectuals, who had in the meantime become far more involved in studying and governing frontier regions, uniformly rejected retreat. On the contrary, several of them, most famously the Beijing-based scholar Geng Zizhen, argued for enlarging Xinjiang's already costly garrisons. To fund this, they recommended bypassing the region's mostly Muslim local elites, instituting direct rule down to the grassroots, which would have incurred vast further expense, and encouraging massive immigration and economic expansion to pay for those measures. The Qing were far too weak at that moment to thoroughly implement such policies, but they did actually begin promoting immigration to Xinjiang rather than impeding it and licensing far more mines there. And crucially, Han elite support for colonizing Xinjiang solidified further during the next few decades, even as the dynasty, including its core regions, was falling into prolonged crisis, which you might have thought would lead to a pullback from marginal frontiers. This showed that these elites now saw Xinjiang as at least potentially part of, quote, civilization, and not to be abandoned. Reinforcing this, the Qing began during the first half of the 19th century to change many Xinjiang place names, substituting names recalling long-gone Chinese outposts in Inner Asia for names in local languages. This rethinking was also evident in another shift of language, explicitly equating the entire Qing realm with Zhongguo. That term, literally meaning central kingdom, it's central country, or in many translations, Middle Kingdom, which sounds so much more exotic, today simply means China. Gong Zizhen, for instance, began his 1827 essay on Xinjiang in a striking but illogical fashion. He begins by saying, "There are many countries under heaven, but none is as large as our great Qing," which sounds much more like a modern notion of plural territorial states than any notion of even potentially universal empire. He then continues, "The country of the great Qing is that which has been called Zhongguo since the time of the mythical ancient sage King Yao. The territory it occupies in the east and south is bordered by the sea. In the north and west, it does not reach the sea, but written agreements can be cited," and so on. The written agreements are the 1689 and 1727 treaties with Russia. And Gong refers soon after to the Qing expanding beyond the territory of all other dynasties. So he was actually reminding his readers that this had not been Chinese territory ever since ancient times. In nonetheless equating all of Qing territory to the setting of China's classical past, he sacralized his own era's borderlands, making them something that any proud inheritor of Chinese culture should want to keep within, quote, China. Gong's move resembles similar grabs for ancient glories by 19th and 20th century nationalists elsewhere, as emphasized by Benedict Anderson, Eric Hobsbawm, and others, though Gong knew nothing of these foreign parallels. For Han literati to equate all of Qing territory with an ancient Zhongguo was important, but not entirely original. Qing rulers had initiated it, mostly in diplomatic contexts, but in some other documents as well. It was not a routine formulation, but it occurred often enough to lay the groundwork for what became routine claims that all Qing territory was China, even after the Qing were gone. But if the whole Qing realm was Zhongguo, then parts of Zhongguo seemed unsuitable for direct rule and civilization, including many areas of Yunnan and Guizhou, which Beijing had claimed since the late 1200s, but had not really ruled in fact. Qing efforts in the 1720s and 1730s to institute direct rule there, replacing tributary chieftains with regular officials, sparked bloody conflicts. Dynastic forces won some, but lost others. The next 60 years saw many of the chiefly lineages that had been removed reinstated, while being gradually subjected to more supervision and pressed to accept Chinese education for some of their sons. These restorations, interestingly, were often accompanied by banning immigrants from entering the chieftains' areas, lest they destabilize things. So again, we see that though the Qing was certainly an expansionist state, they were deeply ambivalent about colonists they did not control, often obstructing the very migrants who were, in the long run, the most important instrument of Chinese expansion. There was even more hesitancy about immigration to steppe borderlands, partly because they offered limited opportunities for farming. Without farms, there was little chance of attracting the kinds of immigrants the Qing wanted. Other resources, especially southwestern mines, were coveted, but that didn't necessarily require direct rule. Indeed, where the Qing saw only non-agricultural resources, they often preferred indirect rule, with chieftains or other local potentates providing desired goods as tribute. While various frontier officials claimed that indigenous miners were less efficient than Chinese ones, the court generally considered any such inefficiency a small price to pay for avoiding the turbulence that they assumed an influx of Chinese miners would bring. Of course, many societies valorized farming over other kinds of production, but that preference was especially strong in China. Cosmologically, agriculture, like sacrifice, was a way in which people joined together heaven and earth, as moral individuals were supposed to do. Miners, on the other hand, were said to gouge the veins of the earth. And while many early modern societies associated frontier resource extraction with dangerous gangs of rowdy, free-spending single men, soldiers, sailors, miners, loggers, cowboys, you name it, the Western version thereof were often imagined as eventually marrying and settling down. As we shall see in a minute, barriers to marriage for non-agricultural frontiersmen in China meant that such transitions to normative family roles were far less common, and they were even more uncommon in cultural representations, leaving such men marked as permanently uncivilized. There were practical reasons why non-agricultural kinds of work were considered unlikely to promote stable residence or give men enough income to form proper families. And mining, logging, etc., did mostly attract single men. For reasons I've discussed elsewhere, China had very few full-time wage laborers for a highly commercial society. Circa 1800, probably less than 15% of income-earning adults got most of their income from wages. Moreover, agricultural laborers earned much less than even most tenants, perhaps a third as much on average, not to mention small farm owners who earned a bit more. Since employers seeking non-agricultural, unskilled labor had no need to pay much more than the farm wage, people like miners, loggers, porters, etc., also earned much less than either tenants or smallholders. And that made it very hard for them to secure wives in a society where sex-selective infanticide plus concubinage created a perpetual shortage of marriageable women. Having no dependents, conversely, allowed these men to live on 1/3 of the not too princely income of a tenant farmer. And it helps explain why the wage-earning population didn't grow. Some people get proletarianized in every generation, but if the last generation of proletarians has very few descendants, the proletariat stays small. But men without wives or legitimate descendants were considered dangerous, with little stake in society, reinforcing their marginality in a vicious cycle. They also tended to move around a lot. Mines, being poorly capitalized, closed frequently, 60% of them within 5 years in one good sample from 18th century Yunnan. Forests were rarely cut sustainably, and even when they were, those who planted them tended to sell their interest in the growing trees and move on after a few years. Mobile people were not properly registered, not restrained by a community, making them even more objects of suspicion and discrimination. In short, so-called liumin, or drifters, maybe vagrants, were seen as sliding downwards from having been liangmin, good subjects, and perhaps as having already become irredeemable. And elites using this term for landless itinerants rarely distinguished mobile workers from unemployed vagrants. Social policy aimed at preventing the emergence of such people in the first place, rather than trying to recuperate them once they'd reached this dismal state. Inviting them into a frontier area was asking for trouble. Where the state did want migrants to come to frontiers, they wanted solid farm families who would bring proper Chinese ways with them and would not mix too much with the locals, much less acculturate to indigenous ways. By contrast, the Qing feared single men, both for their alleged rowdiness, which would cause conflicts with the indigenous population, but also for their willingness to marry indigenes and partly acculturate. The term Han trader Hanjian, which occurs with greatly increased frequency in documents describing the 18th century Southwest, interestingly referred both to those Han who clashed with indigenes and Han who became close to them. It had previously referred only to those who aided an enemy state, but it now expanded to include those who betrayed, in a sense, Chinese culture, leading to unrest that inconvenienced the state. And again, I would emphasize whether they did this by having too much conflict with the local population, or on the contrary, adapting to them too successfully. Now, some contrary voices were heard, especially in the 1720s and 30s, before the campaign to replace chieftains with regular officials had led to so much bloodshed. After that, however, both official and elite opinion had turned very strongly against encouraging migration to most Qing frontiers. After the conquest of Xinjiang was completed in 1759, the emperor himself suggested possibly encouraging immigration, but quickly saw that this had no support. For the next few decades, most non-soldiers going to Xinjiang were exiled criminals. Southwestern policy was less consistent, but there too, single men were rarely wanted. Those who came anyway often faced official harassment. And by law, officials were actually supposed to find them and send them back, and were subject to punishment themselves if they didn't do so, though it's pretty clear that this was not enforced a whole lot. This began to change around 1800. An essay by Shan Yao advocated filling up Xinjiang with impoverished immigrants from the heartland, both for the sake of holding Xinjiang and because it would supposedly give these people a chance to remake themselves into good subjects with proper families. Others made similar arguments and conducted surveys identifying suitable spots, including both areas with non-agricultural resources and places that seemed suitable for large-scale irrigation. Writing in the 1820s, Geng Zejun and soon others made an argument that had barely been heard since the first post-conquest debates about Xinjiang, namely that vagrants in particular should be encouraged to move to the frontier, where both agricultural and other work could make good subjects of them while helping the Qing finance a larger security apparatus, plus a civil administration like those which the core provinces had, but Xinjiang, Mongolia, Tibet, Manchuria, and chieftain-ruled parts of the Southwest did not. Just as important then as Geng Zejun's specific recommendations is what his general formulation erases. It erases the idea that the line between farming and non-farming areas represented an impassable limit of civilized society and Chinese-style rule. Immigrant-fueled economic growth would supposedly fund this civilizing change, but another key condition for it had been slowly unfolding for decades, and that was the post-conquest sedentarization of various non-Han peoples. Many Mongols, for instance, became something like ranchers, moving much less than they used to, and reporting their population and herd sizes to Qing officials, among other things, as a basis for relief in years where too many sheep had died. So when Geng Zejun proposed animal husbandry as one of many non-farming occupations that impoverished Han immigrants could take up in Xinjiang, he did not envision them becoming nomads, which allowed such a move to be deemed civilizing rather than an abandonment of civilization. Changes elsewhere in the empire were also eroding the idea that sedentary equaled agricultural equaled civilized. Around 1800, rebellions by both immigrants and indigenous people had rocked central and southwestern China. This forced emperors, officials, and literati to think about how to restore peace, especially in mountainous areas, which had been the rebel strongholds. Moreover, early Qing hopes that remote, hard-to-rule highlands could simply be kept empty had become impractical, thanks to sustained population growth. Stabilizing the Southwest, they realized, instead required filling the mountains with good subjects. And since those who already had farms elsewhere were unlikely to move uphill in significant numbers, one needed to stabilize the lives of mobile, non-agricultural people. When the official and essayist Yen Rui, famous for his role in suppressing these turn of the 19th century rebellions, discussed how to prevent various highland forests, recently cleared of rebels, but still favored by smugglers, fugitives, etc., from spawning renewed unrest, he argued against creating farms there. He rightly saw this as ecologically unsustainable, since replacing trees with annual crops led to rapid erosion. Instead, Yen supported peopling these highlands with loggers, miners, paper makers, and others engaged in traditionally dangerous occupations, as long as those enterprises could be rendered sufficiently stable that the people involved would remain in one place, rather than exhausting a given site or running out of funds to exploit it fully and then moving on. If these people stayed put, Yen argued, they could be properly registered, form stable families and lineages, tend ancestral graves, pay taxes, join community compacts, making them responsible for each other's behavior, and even raise future candidates for the civil service exams, becoming proper subjects. It was social strategies like these, Yen claimed, that had raised militia who turned the tide against rebels after conventional armies had failed. Other Sichuan, Yunnan, and Guizhou officials claimed during the 1810s to 1840s that similar methods were keeping the peace in their jurisdictions, which were indeed generally peaceful in those decades. Wu Qijun, Governor General of Yunnan and Guizhou in 1844-45, even claimed that when governed properly, which included occasional government loans, miners, loggers, etc., were better than farmers for stabilizing frontiers because they congregated in larger groups, making it easier to organize them. He encouraged mining entrepreneurs to lead many such organizations, effectively delegating grassroots government to such people with very limited oversight. This was a huge shift from traditional notions that trustworthy community organizations should consist of solid farmers led by Confucian gentlemen, not people like miners led by merchants. Wu's preference for miners and loggers becomes less surprising in light of what happened in Yunnan and Guizhou, when large numbers of farm families, whom earlier officials had thought would be preferable immigrants, finally showed up. Beginning around 1800, roughly the same time as these rebellions, natural disasters and civil unrest in Hunan and Jiangxi did cause many landowning families to head to the southwest. Officials had been much more sympathetic to these disaster victim families than to the earlier single drifters, and usually supported them in disputes with locals, disputes which became increasingly frequent, precisely because these migrants sought scarce farmland, didn't intermarry with locals, and so kept their identities as people from, as they put it, the heartland. Thus, they were actually much more destabilizing than the so-called vagrants whom officials had feared, and provoked enormous rebellions in the mid-19th century. Similar shifts happened on other Chinese frontiers at about the same time. Officials in Taiwan, for instance, had long tried to balance the interests of settlers and indigenous chiefs, often leaning towards the chiefs who helped keep order in return for the Qing respecting their privileges, but shifted sharply towards the settlers in the 19th century, praising them for developing the land and generating revenue, while increasingly seeing the indigenous population as incurably violent. And there were parallels beyond China too, including, for instance, Jacksonian America, where greater inclusion of landless, lower-class whites as full citizens went along with increasingly consistent and violent state support for those people in their seizure of indigenous lands. Now, this rethinking was limited at least compared to what would come in the 20th century. Farming certainly retained a privileged ideological status in China. But arability was no longer considered absolutely required for a territory's inclusion in a civilized Chinese polity. Nor was farming the absolute precondition for being a good subject. In erasing the idea that the limits of agriculture were also the limits of the civilized polity, these thinkers were not restoring an ancient idea of universal empire. On the contrary, as already noted, someone like Gong Zizhen and the Qing themselves increasingly assumed territorial borders in roughly the modern sense. These two trends help make the unprecedentedly large outline of the multi-ethnic Qing, I'll remind you again how much it looks like that of today's PRC, compatible with long-standing ideas of a unified, culturally based polity. While mass nationalism still lay in the future, this rethinking allowed early and mid-19th century thinkers to associate an imagined community that traced its origins to Yao and other ancient Chinese heroes, with a territory roughly double what could have been even loosely considered Chinese in 1680. It thus helped prepare the late Qing and Republic to meet a test that late Romanov, Habsburg, and Ottoman official nationalisms all failed. The one that Benedict Anderson describes as stretching the short, tight skin of the nation over the gigantic body of the empire. It also helped people imagine that an enlarged frontier presence might be financially sustainable, a cautious but crucial step towards 20th century visions of frontier Eldorados, one that one sees in the writings of, among other people, Mao Zedong. Those 20th century schemes for filling Xinjiang, Mongolia, et cetera, with millions of migrants that I mentioned earlier, made little headway in the capital-poor, war-torn Republic of China, but they left behind plans that had great influence on post-1949 projects. Those dreams of mass frontier settlement also went along with a further shift in thinking about the frontiersmen themselves. By the 1920s, they were often portrayed as the hardy vanguard of the nation, who, by struggling in a harsh environment to extract resources China needed, while moving away from the supposedly effete and over-civilized territories of Eastern China, were not only rescuing the nation, but in 20th century social Darwinist parlance, were revitalizing the race. This discursive move was also far from a uniquely Chinese phenomenon. We find similar stories told about American urbanites going west, Germans going to Brazil, French colonists in Algeria, Zionists leaving Europe, and so on. By contrast to these long-range outcomes, what the Qing figures I've focused on today took were mostly steps towards rethinking the realm rather than implementing huge projects. As we know, Gong Zizhen and others wrote about the importance of tightening control over China's far west, just as a century began in which the Qing and their successors would have tremendous difficulty holding even their core territories against assorted internal rebels and foreign invaders. But those crises made the appearance of new rationales for holding on to territories once considered useless even more important. Without the reorientation we've discussed today, one can easily imagine either a Qing withdrawal from its most remote territories while it was struggling to hold its core regions, or the troubled and strongly racialized Republic of China abandoning some non-Han parts of the Manchu Imperium. Instead, both regimes and their communist successors doubled down on controlling such spaces. When the late Qing intensified their presence in frontier zones from Taiwan to Xinjiang, they were then in some ways joining a swelling global mainstream of states seeking more precise borders, as well as greater internal control and uniformity. Nor were they the only vulnerable power that moved more aggressively than before on its frontiers, even while it faced challenges in its core areas. Lake Tokugawa and early Meiji expansion in Hokkaido, the Bonin Islands, and elsewhere provide one parallel case. Ottoman efforts at colonization in North Africa, the Sudan, and elsewhere provide another, in which Muslim refugees from territories the Ottomans were losing in the Balkans were actually encouraged to settle new frontiers, paralleling in some ways the role that Hunanese displaced by civil war in their home province played in the late Qing reconquest and attempted signification of Muslim territories in the far northwest and southwest. Such efforts by different states often reinforced each other. Indeed, they may have done so especially strongly when they bumped up against each other, as we saw in the Qing and Romanov closing of the Xinjiang frontier earlier. Something similar happened on China's post-1870s southwest frontiers. The British in Burma and French in Indochina simultaneously provided threats that justified heightened efforts to control minority regions of Yunnan and Guangxi, models of how those efforts could work. There are actually many positive references in late Qing and Republican sources to, for instance, British strategies for strengthening control of North Burma hill tribes. And sometimes they even provided an explicit partner, as French and Chinese authorities, for instance, both wanted enough order in what had been tribal areas of Yunnan to facilitate exporting the region's tin along a French-built railway to Haiphong. Revenues from that trade then became essential to expanding both the military and the bureaucratic apparatus of Yunnan province during the 1910s to 40s. And as already noted, the dreams of irrigation and mineral-driven development, massive immigration, and social Darwinist expectations about the regenerative potential of such efforts were very much global phenomena, some of which still echo today. But why use any global frame rather than tell a strictly Chinese story? There is, after all, a danger in doing so, beyond that of stretching beyond one's expertise. And one doesn't want to make the increasingly aggressive colonization and state-making and the increasing disregard of even elite indigenes that were so widespread in the 19th century places I've discussed seem that much more natural by emphasizing Chinese parallels with stories independent of China, the Western, Russian, Japanese cases. To avoid that, I think it helps both to highlight the differences among all these cases and stress that the developments that allowed for China's partial convergence to these global forms of empire and nation building may have been internally generated, but were nonetheless dramatic changes that would have shocked 18th century Chinese. If we use a prospective view from as late as 1790, the distinctive and surprising nature of modernity stands out as a worldwide phenomenon, notwithstanding the numerous and important particularities that persisted within it. And one thing modern nation states certainly share is that they fetishize these persistent differences, while often hiding how global their histories are. So while the history that I've offered today includes one dimension strongly embraced by official historiography in today's PRC, with the government celebrating their role as successors to the Qing legacy in a way that would have been unthinkable within the Marxist framework of the 1950s to 80s, state-approved histories all vehemently object other parts of the story I've given you, denying that China could possibly be an example of global stories about empire and expansion, much less settler colonialism. When I presented some very early thoughts about this project at a Chinese conference back in 2010, I thought that my Chinese interlocutors might welcome my suggestion that, having lacked some of the biological allies that Crosby pointed to in European colonizations, Chinese expansion had often involved more negotiation. Instead, I was told that there had never been any Chinese colonization to compare to processes elsewhere. A couple of years later, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences launched an all caps broadside against what Western scholars call the new Qing history, condemning as separatist myth-making that scholarship's focus on the Qing as a multi-ethnic empire and on how particularly Manchu practices had facilitated the absorption of so much new territory. Instead, mainland historiography insists on seeing the Qing strictly as Sinified Manchus, who thereby represented the climax of a more traditional and continuous Chinese statecraft. Textbooks of the last decade have gone even further, essentially projecting today's borders, plus Taiwan, into the distant past as a preordained telos. In short, for PRC ideologues, denial of any supranational framework for thinking about how China got so big is very much tied to not taking any subnational stories seriously. Only a retrospective, strictly national view is permitted. By contrast, treating Chinese expansion as world history helps open up its contingencies, as using multiple spatial frames also unsettles the teleologies of other nations, while broadening our understanding of how nations themselves emerged as a worldwide phenomenon. Thus, I hope a world history that mixes different spatial scales, engaging in back and forth with a national narrative, rather than assuming its inferiority, strikes me as doing more to help us think as global citizens than history on any one spatial scale, even a consistently global one, could do. Thank you. Okay, I see Dominic.
Thanks a lot, Ken. So thank you very much for this beautiful and thought-provoking lecture. And indeed, what you managed to do successfully in this lecture, and also as in all your work, is to move between these different scales: the local, the regional, the trans-regional, the national, and then of course the global. So we are almost out of time, but I think I could imagine that we take a few more minutes for discussion.
Sure. Yes.
So if that's possible, if you agree.
Of course.
Yeah, then maybe if you, like in the audience, if you raise your virtual or your real hand, then let us know.
Right, there's a reactions button at the bottom of your screen if you're on Zoom. If you click that, there will be a raise hand thing.
Or alternatively, you just switch on your cameras and raise your real hand. Yeah? So, yeah.
And if you're sitting in the room, there's this thing.
Oh yeah, like I don't see people in the room. So if you want to take questions in the room, Ken, then we could do that.
Well, we'll just see what we get.
Okay.
This is fairly small, actually. Emily?
Yeah, thank you for that talk. It was really wonderful to hear these different ideas about how to deal with other peoples, and especially those foundational ideas that you talked about. I was wondering about something that comes up in the talk. If you could talk about it more, which is demographics and population pressures and ideas about population. I mean, that comes up in those ideas about moving, this territory will have 160 million people. So clearly ideas about reproduction are live, but they don't seem to be that central to your talk. So I'm just wondering if you could elaborate.
Okay, so clearly by the late 19th.
So, Ken, could you repeat that question, because the online community couldn't hear it very well?
Okay, so the question was really about the role of demographic ideas and ideas of population pressure specifically. So clearly by the turn of the 20th century, this is something of an obsession, all over the world. The idea that, as a German chancellor of the time put it, we must either export products or export people. And there's a kind of neo-Malthusian frame that's very, very common and does inform things like this daft calculation that you could put 160 million people in southern Xinjiang. What I think is interesting is that by the late 18th century, there are clearly people in China thinking, we've got more people than we can comfortably support. And yet you will search in vain for an explicit link between that and frontier policy. I mean, I think that when someone like Yen Rui in the 1810s says it's futile to imagine going back to the old idea that the highlands should simply be emptied of people, people are going to move in. So the question is how we manage them. Population growth must somehow be on his mind. And yet he never says population growth. What he talks about much more is commercial growth. What he says is the people down in the valleys want more wood and want more this and want more that. And so people are going to move on to vacant land to grow those things. So population pressure is there, but it's not a simple story. I mean, it's not a Malthusian, oh, we must abandon our opposition to settling these places because we simply have too many people to put elsewhere. You know, you have to think that that's sort of circulating somehow, but the argument is never made that way until much, much later. And it's not entirely clear to me why, but some of it clearly is that the one thing most of these highlands weren't all that good for was generating food. And so if you're really thinking in Malthusian terms, you're much better off, you know, irrigating some more of the valleys in Hunan than investing in the mountains.
Maybe I could follow up with another question.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think you tell us a very intriguing story of the reorientation of China, and as you quoted, somebody's like pulling the tight skin over the large body of the country, right, or of the nation. And I wonder, in this process, what role Manchuria actually also plays, both as a real and a symbolic event, both on a regional and, if we talk about global historical level as well. Because I mean, as we know, right, like the Han migration into Manchuria started semi-illegally in the 18th century and picked up speed in the 19th century. It wasn't really endorsed by the Qing at first, and then later it came to be. And didn't that in some ways also contribute to the idea that undeveloped land was then developed through Han settlers, and maybe then also like it developed or contributed towards a certain idea that the nation then has the potential to turn allegedly unarable lands into like agricultural space. And that's just the first part of my question. Then the second part is, and at the same time, or shortly after that process is happening, almost at the same time, it really becomes like a fracture zone of globalization, so to speak, like a hotspot through the South Manchurian Railway and the Russian and the Japanese Empire, and the whole story unfolds, right?
Right. No, Manchuria is interesting that way, but I think the point you made in passing, right, that until the mid-19th century, most of the settlement there is illegal, made it very hard to acknowledge it as a model, right? So everybody knows that there's more and more settlement, especially in southern Manchuria. And by 1850, Beijing gets about a third of its food from southern Manchuria. The Yangtze Delta gets desperately needed soybean fertilizer, also from Manchuria. Everybody knows that, but when the court is still saying this shouldn't be going on, it's hard to make it a model. Later in the 19th century, I think it's very clear that it becomes a model. Though it's interesting there that even then, as late as the 1920s, when there are famine relief operations that involve moving desperate people on the North China Plain to Manchuria, there's open debate about, well, should single men be eligible? Or are they rowdies who are just going to to cause problems. The old ideas take a long time to die, even in a setting that clearly is ecologically quite well suited to farming. And that, as you say, then in the 1920s and 30s becomes this globalized fracture zone, right? The issue of whether everybody knows by the first third of the 20th century that Manchuria is capable of generating vast grain surpluses. And the question has become, are those going to feed a Chinese industrialization process, a Russian industrialization process, or a Japanese industrialization process? You know, very much, I mean, it's hard not to see the parallel this morning to the debate that's going on at the same moment about whether Eastern Europe and Ukraine, everybody knows they're going to generate lots and lots of extra grain. Are they going to feed a Soviet industrialization process or a German one? You know, in the early 20th century, those are very much parallel stories, right? But, you know, I think that comes into focus relatively late, and therefore isn't sort of, it's not the crucible in which these new ideas of the frontier as El Dorado form. I think those have much more to do actually with the Northwest and to some extent the Southwest. And those Northwestern ideas, on the one hand, start earlier. You know, you look at these turn of the 19th century maps in which people imagine these enormous irrigation projects. You know, they couldn't do them, but they're thinking about them. And then, of course, in the 1930s, ironically, the image of the Northwest as El Dorado is given a very significant push precisely by the fact that you've just lost the Northeast to Japan. And there's this obsession with where will, you know, X, Y, and Z resources come from now that Japan has, you know, has seized Toynbee.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Jakob.
Yeah, I have two questions if we still have time for it.
Fine with me.
One inspired by Andy's question just now about the demographic, but also sexual policies of this. So if we're thinking about migrant men and all the debates that are taking place over a relatively long time, what's the role of rogue male, single men going out to the frontiers, and how are they going to support or undermine the civilization process and the nation building process? Then the counterpart for that obviously is, if you assume that they're going to stay sometime, there must have been some thinking about will they shack up or marry indigenous women? And so was there any discourse about the women who could become their partners? Are they civilizable, or is that just an assumption that what matters are the men and women will adapt, and the women in themselves are just not being theorized?
So on the one hand, there's surprisingly...
Sorry, could you briefly summarize the question again for the Zoomers?
Jakob's question was, to what extent is there a discussion and a theorization of relations between immigrant men on the frontier and women, mostly indigenous women? And on the one hand, it's surprising how little discourse there is. Yen Rui, for instance, who really, really wants these men to settle down and get married, never talks about who the women are going to be. The people who do talk about indigenous women tend to paint them very negatively. That the danger is that the men will assimilate or acculturate to the women's culture, rather than a kind of confidence that the men will win the women over. And some of that may simply represent demographic realities, right? If you're going to move into a village where you're one of relatively few Han Chinese men, and there are lots and lots of indigenous people, well, some of it I think is just outright paranoia. And there are quotations from Qing officials, I mean, not many, but some, that sound spookily like European colonials in the 19th century, saying things like, well, if Han Chinese men marry Miao women, you will get children who have Miao loyalties, because the women basically raise them, the kids, but they will have Han cunning, and such half-breeds will be very dangerous. You know, that it sounds like a British official in various parts of the world. So you get some of that. It is interesting. I mean, I wouldn't want to push this too far, but we know a little bit more about the merchants who marry indigenous women. And in the Southwest, it does appear that they tend to acculturate. Perhaps logically, because again, merchants, unlike say farmers, don't settle in a great swarm, right? A single merchant or a few of them move into a town, and very often the indigenous woman has contacts that are very valuable. And it's remarked by a number of observers that these men often tend to become more and more like the local culture. It's a little bit different in the Northwest, in part because Islam complicates the story in certain ways. But definitely there's a sense that the men could marry local women, and a real concern that that's not a good thing. And as I said, the term hanjian, Han trader, is applied often indiscriminately on the one hand to the men who stir up trouble, who at least in the imagination are usually thought of as being single rowdy men, and to the men who acculturate too well, who are often the men who marry. It's also worth noting in the Southwest in particular, that you have a significant number of minority groups there who by custom pass land from the father to the son-in-law. So if you're a single Han Chinese male migrant, right, this is almost too good to be true, right? Back home, you have no land and you can't get married. Here, you might find a wife and you get land out of the deal. I would also say, I mean, here I'm on very, very thin ice, but we do have collections of what purport to be Miao folktales. And of course, they're mostly written down by Han ethnographers, so take them with many grains of salt. But many of them have stories of an immigrant male marrying a local woman. And what's interesting in the stories is that the story often winds up just fine for the couple. It's not that the woman suffers, but wind up quite badly for her local society as represented by her male elders. So there's more than one of them that end with the man acculturating with the help of his wife, who sort of tells him what to do to survive. And then if at the end, I mean, I'm thinking of one in particular where the father-in-law, who's clearly a local chieftain of some sort, is constantly scheming to get rid of the son-in-law, and in the end literally blows himself up in his attempt to do this. And the story ends with this kind of weird, well, the husband and wife lived happily ever after. But clearly the old society as represented by the father-in-law does not live happily ever after. You know, I don't want to read that in too flat-footed a way as, oh, this tells us what happened. But I think the presence of those tales is suggestive. Salvatore, you're muted. You're still muted.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can unmute you. I'm not sure I can. I can ask you to unmute. Okay, go, try now.
Now it should be okay.
Salvatore, we're still not hearing you. I'm not sure why. Yeah, if you want to type your question in the chat, we can maybe do it that way. Let me try looking there. Oh, now he's muted again. No, we're still not hearing you. It says you're unmuted. No, now it says you're muted again. I'm not sure what the problem is. It may be that we have to admit defeat. I don't know.
No. Yeah.
Well, Dominic, shall we throw in the towel?
Is there any other question in the room or somebody who was?
Oh, Guy?
Could you elaborate more on this idea, this persistent idea that agricultural life equates with civilized life? That, for instance, what you refer to as proletarianized miners, they are regarded in China proper as well as rowdy, and,
absolutely,
et cetera, possible bandits and so on. What other kinds of proletarianized occupations are there that are also regarded as a tendency toward
yeah, I think the answer is that most proletarianized occupations, unless they have very obvious civilizational skills, like hired tutors who are obviously literate and so forth, are regarded as civilizationally questionable. And some of that, I think, does have to do with the preference for agriculture in a society in which, even in the 1930s, if you believe the Buck surveys, only something like 15% of all agricultural labor is performed for wages. And even a lot of that 15% is people who actually have a little bit of land, but it's just not quite enough. So they supplement it with wages, right? So, as we know, the peasantry in China holds on and survives a long, long time, right? And agriculture is equated with people who either own some land or who, even if they're tenants, are often secure long-term tenants and are seen as people who have a stake and who don't move much. I mean, obviously people do move a lot, but the perception is that, agriculture is associated with rootedness in more ways than one. Agriculture is also, as I said briefly, cosmologically, right? It is a way in which humans join the contributions of heaven in the form of rain and sunshine with the contributions of earth to produce sustenance for all, which is, a cosmological good thing, right? It's the equivalent of sacrifice, which is also about humans uniting heaven and earth. So it's almost a sacred act, as well as being, in an obvious material way, an essential act. The other thing, which it's kind of hard to sketch here quickly, but in part because so much Chinese land is occupied either by owner-occupiers or by secure tenants, what you get, and secure tenants, a secure tenant is a tenant on whom it's hard to raise the rent to capture the full measure of whatever productivity gains you get. And so if you look over time in China, what you see is that rent rises lag behind productivity gains. And so tenants, not to say that many of them aren't very poor, but tenants, in a sense, have a kind of proprietorship in their security as tenants, which means that the income they are earning includes a portion that's actually a return not to their labor, but to an asset that they have, that asset being their security of tenure. And over time, a considerable gap develops between the income of a tenant and the income of an agricultural wage laborer, right? If this was the world of Econ 101, a tenant and a wage laborer should earn the same thing after the rent is paid. It's nowhere near the case. Wage laborers are much, much poorer, sufficiently poorer that in a market for marriage, in which there's a structural shortage of women due to sex-selective infanticide and neglect, as well as to concubinage, the poorest guys lose out. The poorest guys are very, very heavily associated with the guys who are engaged in wage labor. Meanwhile, imagine yourself now as a man in the town who wants to hire somebody for unskilled wage labor, right? You need a guy to haul your stuff from one place to the other. Unless there's an institution, a guild of some sort, that can step in and force you to do otherwise, you're going to pay a tiny fraction above the agricultural wage, right? You're going to pay as little as you can, which is just barely enough to attract that person. And that's going to be way below a tenant income. Consequently, unskilled wage labor outside of agriculture also tends to earn a good deal less than tenancy, not to mention landowning, contributing further to these people being excluded from the marriage market, seen as marginal to the community. And because they're seen as marginal to the community, also seen as dangerous. You get the myth of the bear stick, who we know turn up very, very disproportionately as criminal suspects. And maybe they did commit more than their share of crimes, but it's also quite likely that they were disproportionately fingered for crimes, because who better to finger than the guy who has no real connections? Especially since, again, if you're a tenant with security, you stay in the same place. If you're a wage laborer, you're in this village this week or this year, and in another one where you're now a newcomer and a stranger. So there's a kind of ongoing marginalization and pathologization, is that a word? Of the wage laborer, which I think goes along with the questions about people like miners and loggers, et cetera. And it goes along with the sort of unsteadiness of their lives, the fact that unlike some of their Western peers, they're not at a later point in their life cycle that likely to be able to settle down and marry conventional and have conventional families. And at least in the case of mining, partly because of the suspicions of miners and mining, mines tend to be undercapitalized. It's a discriminated against sector. A mine that is undercapitalized is going to scratch the surface and then move on rather than dig deep. And so, again, I cited that statistic from Yunnan where over half of mines closed within 5 years of opening. And so that's one of the reasons why people like Yen Rui, when they want to recuperate people like miners as good subjects, they're obsessed with the idea of how can we get people to practice these trades in a way that keeps them in one place. If we can just do that and find a way for them to earn enough, they'll get married, they'll tend ancestral graves, they'll register for the Baoja. Life will be peaches and cream, but somehow you got to get them to that.
Just as a quick addition, paper makers who source their materials from the locality are basically incorporated into the peasantry that are called zhilong, and are treated as if they were farmers. I think the same would be true for other artisans who source their materials locally. Even if they sell the final product, if they're completely even if they're completely marketized, as of course they have to be in selling their product. As long as the raw materials are locally sourced, they can be seen as if they were.
I mean, that makes sense to me. I mean, oddly enough, Yen Rui and a couple of other people do include paper makers among these sort of dubious highland trades, but maybe he just didn't know much about their actual community relations.
They start off being migratory, and after a while they settle down.
That makes sense.
What about the very large population of apprentices in various urban settings? They stay in one place for a particular period.
And they are often organized through something like a native place organization or something, right? So even though, I mean, we know, for instance, from Bill Rowe that those craftsman organizations often got pretty rowdy, for instance, during the Dragon Boat festivals and so forth. You know, they were more or less contained. And, you know, they're part of an entity that both takes care of them and polices them. And you see more and more of that in the late Qing, where, for instance, Chongqing, I guess, is the best documented case, but where we see the state more and more reaching out to these Tongxianghui, native place organizations, and also to occupational guilds, and saying essentially, you govern your people, please, right? Because you know where they are at any given time. We often don't, right? And that, I think, is crucial. And that's also what someone like Wu Qijun is trying to do with miners and loggers in Yunnan and Guizhou, out in the rural areas. And he at least claims great success. We don't have enough reports to know how much of that he's making up. But we do know that, after the intense violence of the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, from say 1815 to 1845, the Southwest is pretty peaceful. Maybe this stuff is actually working.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, weird. Okay, I think we have.
Okay. Yeah, just one suggestion. These questions are very hard to hear. So now Salvatore has one more question that he put in the chat.
Okay,
so if you answer this one, and then we could close maybe the online part, and you could continue your discussion in Chicago.
Okay.
Without the online community, I think that might be, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So Salvatore's question is about Chinese current affairs, for instance, Hong Kong or the future occupation of Taiwan. In the past, there was a legitimate political orientation, i.e. agricultural policy or industrialization, but now, oh gee, thanks for that one. Clearly part of what I have talked about, I mean, this kind of sacralization of a certain outline of China has a role to play in current Chinese claims over both Hong Kong and Taiwan, but I wouldn't want to push it that far. I mean, we should remember that, as late as World War II, when people talked about China, they often excluded Taiwan, right? That the Chinese Republic, which based its claims to sovereignty in a place like Xinjiang on the claim that on the idea that they were the inheritors of the Qing. Well, by the same token, since the Qing had signed away Taiwan, they didn't make a big deal about claiming Taiwan, right? Not until the defeat of Japan, and then of course also Chiang Kai-shek taking refuge there and the PRC wanting to finish the destruction of the nationalist regime. There was also, again, I think for somewhat similar reasons, that it was treaty-based, not a huge amount of nationalist outcry over Hong Kong until, the calendar began to move closer to 97, and this became a goal that was in reach and something that the government could make a big deal over. But during, for instance, the Hong Kong riots in 67, Zhou Enlai is quite explicit about saying, for God's sake, stop with this stuff about how the British need to get out. We are not interested in taking Hong Kong at this point. There are clear reasons now for the regime to cast its claims over both those places as part of a kind of inevitable telos of Chinese, quote, rejuvenation. But, these are very, very much 20th or to some extent even 21st century constructions. I think it would be hard to draw a line between the Qing notions of what was Chinese and current events either in Hong Kong or in Taiwan.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ken. Yeah, so I think, we could now close the online part. Yeah, okay. So let me just say on behalf of the Toynbee Prize Foundation, congratulations for this prize, and thanks a lot for this wonderful lecture. I would love to take you out for dinner or lunch in Chicago time. Dinner would be better, but I think we could do that some other time, hopefully.
Sometime soon.
Hopefully sometime soon, right? So
on one side of the ocean or the other.
Right, okay, yeah. Okay, so I think we'll close the online session right now. So I say goodbye, and I hope you have a good discussion in Chicago.
Okay.
So, right. Goodbye, bye.